They stood at the very center of the most powerful and murderous regime in modern history, draped in furs and diamonds, presiding over lavish state banquets while the world outside burned. They were the wives and mistresses of Hitler's inner circle, women who shared beds, dinner tables, and secrets with the architects of the Holocaust. Some of them were true believers, fanatical in their devotion to National Socialism and to the men who built it. Others were opportunists, drawn by wealth and status into a world of unimaginable luxury purchased with the blood of millions. And some, a very few, would quietly resist, harbor doubts, or try to carve out some small private space that the regime had not yet consumed. But when the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, all of them faced a moment of reckoning. The question that echoes across the decades is a haunting one. What happened to these women? Were they held accountable for the crimes committed in the name of their husbands and their cause? Were they stripped of their wealth, their privileges, their carefully constructed identities? Or did they manage, as so many did in post-war Germany, to simply walk away and begin again as though the whole catastrophe had never happened? In this video, we are going to find out. We will trace the lives of the women who stood closest to the most monstrous men of the 20th century. From the underground bunker in Berlin, where the Reich breathed its last, to the quiet suburbs and alpine villages, where survivors tried to rebuild lives in the ashes of everything they had helped to create. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. There is perhaps no more famous and no more tragic figure in this story than Eva Braun, the woman who spent 12 years as Adolf Hitler's secret companion and who became his wife for less than 40 hours before dying by his side in the ruins of the capital they had helped to destroy. Eva Anna Paula Braun was born on February 6, 1912 in Munich, the second of three daughters in a solidly middle-class Bavarian family. Her father, Friedrich Braun, was a schoolteacher, a proud and somewhat conservative man who had no particular political leanings that anyone would later remark upon. Eva was educated by the English Sisters, a Catholic order, and was by most accounts a lively, athletic, and rather ordinary young woman who loved skiing, swimming, gymnastics, and going to the cinema. She had no particular intellectual ambitions and no great passion for politics. In 1929, at the age of 17, she began working as an assistant at the photography and film studio of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer, who operated out of a shop on the Schellingstrasse in Munich. It was through Hoffmann that she met Hitler, then 40 years old, who visited the studio regularly. The Führer was introduced to her simply as a Herr Wolf, and it was some time before she understood who exactly this rather intense older gentleman was. Their relationship developed slowly and was kept in conditions of absolute secrecy. Hitler visited her whenever he was in Munich, and while publicly he cultivated the image of a man married entirely to Germany and to his cause, privately he established Eva in a comfortable apartment and later installed her at his Berghof retreat above Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. The nature of the relationship was in many ways a deeply unhappy one, at least for Eva. Hitler was frequently absent, frequently distracted, and fundamentally uninterested in the kind of domestic warmth or emotional reciprocity that any normal relationship requires. Eva occupied a position of profound social invisibility. She was not permitted to appear at official events, was kept hidden from foreign dignitaries and from the German public, and was expected to make herself scarce whenever Hitler's political responsibilities demanded his attention, which was essentially always. She was a secret kept from the German people, who had no idea that their Führer maintained a long-term companion. The loneliness of this arrangement drove Eva at least twice to desperate acts. In November 1932, she shot herself in the chest in what many historians have interpreted as a genuine suicide attempt, and in May 1935 she overdosed on sleeping pills. Both times she survived. Both times Hitler visited her during her recovery, and the relationship continued, deeper entangled despite his fundamental emotional unavailability. In the years that followed, she settled into the gilded cage of the Berghof with a kind of resigned acceptance. She entertained the wives of senior Nazi leaders, swam in the outdoor pool, photographed the mountain scenery, and waited for whatever attention Hitler had to spare. What did Eva Braun know about the crimes of the regime? This question has occupied historians for decades. She was not a member of the party's inner councils. She attended no military briefings and received no secret memoranda. but she was present at the Berghof during years when the Holocaust was being planned and executed, and she moved in circles where the nature of that project was known and spoken about, at least in euphemistic terms. She never expressed any recorded concern for the victims of Nazi persecution, and her private correspondence suggests someone entirely absorbed in the immediate pleasures and frustrations of her own life, with little apparent awareness of or interest in the catastrophe unfolding beyond the garden walls. As the war turned disastrously against Germany in its final years, the Berghof became increasingly empty of its brilliant company, as generals and ministers ceased their social visits and the reality of imminent defeat pressed in from all sides. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin and the situation became entirely hopeless, Eva made the decision that would define her legacy. Against Hitler's explicit instructions, she travelled to Berlin to join him in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery garden. She had no illusions about what this meant. She came to die. On April 29, 1945, in the early hours of the morning, with the Red Army fighting street by street through the ruins of Berlin above their heads, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the map room of the bunker. Their witnesses were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. Eva wore a black silk taffeta dress, Hitler's favourite, and reportedly wept with emotion during the ceremony. They held a brief wedding breakfast afterward, where Hitler's secretaries later remembered his rambling monologues about the betrayal of the German people and the villainy of those who had surrendered to the enemy. The following day, April 30th, 1945, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives in his private rooms. He shot himself through the right temple with his service pistol. Eva chose cyanide. She was 33 years old. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery garden, doused with petrol, and burned in accordance with Hitler's instructions. Soviet forces reached the site the following day and later confirmed the discovery of charred remains. The woman who had spent 12 years in the shadows of the most powerful and terrible man in the world had chosen in the end to disappear with him rather than face a world he had unmade. If Eva Braun represents one kind of devoted loyalty to a monstrous man, then Magda Goebbels represents something even darker, a woman who not only chose death alongside the regime, but who took her own children with her. Johanna Maria Magdalena Behrendt, known to history as Magda Goebbels, was born on November 11, 1901, in Berlin, the illegitimate daughter of Augusta Behrendt, and a man whose identity was for years a matter of some dispute. Her early life was marked by the upheavals that characterized German middle-class existence in the years following the First World War. She received an excellent education at a convent school in Belgium, learned French fluently, and developed the sophisticated social poise that would later make her such an effective hostess for the Nazi regime. In 1921, she married Günther Quandt, a wealthy industrialist considerably older than herself, with whom she had a son, Harold Quandt, in 1921. The marriage was unhappy and ended in divorce in 1929, leaving Magda financially secure and socially well-established. It was in 1930 that Magda Behrendt Quandt first attended a Nazi Party rally and heard Joseph Goebbels speak. The effect was immediate and profound. She joined the party shortly afterward and began volunteering at the Berlin Party headquarters, where she came to the attention of Goebbels himself, who was immediately captivated by her beauty, her intelligence, and her social confidence. Their relationship developed rapidly, and in December 1931 they married in a ceremony at which Hitler was best man. The Führer was deeply fond of Magda and made no secret of this admiration, reportedly telling associates that if he had ever decided to marry, Magda Goebbels was the woman he would have chosen. This closeness to Hitler gave Magda a unique and extraordinary position in the Nazi hierarchy. She became the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich, the hostess at grand state functions, the face of the ideal German wife and mother that Nazi propaganda celebrated so tirelessly. She and Joseph would have 6 children together: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, their names all beginning with H in honour of Adolf Hitler. The marriage between Magda and Joseph Goebbels was a tormented one. Goebbels was a serial womanizer whose affairs were so numerous and so flagrant that Magda reportedly asked Hitler to intervene on at least one occasion. The most serious crisis came in 1938, when Goebbels fell violently in love with the Czech actress Lida Barova and announced, to Magda that he intended to divorce her to be with his mistress. Magda appealed directly to Hitler, who was furious with his propaganda minister and ordered the relationship ended immediately, threatening to expel Goebbels from the party if he pursued the matter further. Goebbels obeyed, Barivar was driven from Germany, and the marriage limped forward. Magda is said to have never forgiven her husband and to have continued the relationship more out of political calculation and ideological commitment than any genuine feeling. And yet, at the end, she remained. When it became clear in April 1945 that the war was lost and that the Nazi regime would not survive, Magda rejected every opportunity to escape or to at least send her children to safety. She announced, with a chilling calm that those around her found deeply disturbing, that her children could not and would not live in a world without National Socialism. On the night of May 1st, 1945, Magda Goebbels personally administered cyanide capsules to each of her 6 children as they slept in their bunker quarters, or in some accounts while they were sedated. She killed Helga, 12, Hildegard, 11, Helmut, 9, Holdine, 8, Hedwig, 6, and Heydrich, 4. She then went upstairs to the Chancellery Garden with her husband, where both of them died, Joseph by a combination of shooting and cyanide, Magda by cyanide alone. She was 43 years old. Only her eldest child, Harold Quandt, who was a Luftwaffe officer serving on the front, survived the war. Magda Goebbels has been described by historians as among the most chilling figures of the Nazi regime, precisely because she was not the monster her husband was in any conventional sense. She was educated, cultured, and by many accounts, genuinely kind in her personal dealings. And yet she chose to carry the ideology to its most terrible personal conclusion, deciding that her children were better dead than living in a Germany that had been liberated from the ideology she had devoted her adult life to serving. Moving now to one of the most tenacious and enduring of Nazi wives, we come to Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's deputy Führer, and the man who, in one of the strangest episodes of the entire war, flew solo to Scotland in May 1941 in what he claimed was a personal peace mission. Ilse Prühl was born on January 2, 1900, and her path to the centre of the Nazi movement began in the turbulent early years of the Weimar Republic, when she became drawn to the rising tide of German nationalism. In 1921, she initially joined the Nazi Party and then rejoined in 1925 after the party had been temporarily banned, following the failed Beer Hall Putsch of 1923. It was through the party that she met Rudolf Hess, but their courtship was not a straightforward one. Hess hesitated to commit to a relationship for years, and it was Ilse herself who played an unexpected role in bringing him closer to Adolf Hitler, whom she introduced him to through the social circles that wealthy Munich women maintained around the party's rising star. Hitler took a deep personal interest in facilitating the match and played an active role in encouraging Hess to formalize his relationship with Ilse. The couple married on December 20th, 1927 in Munich, and Hitler later stood as godfather to their only child, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, born in 1937. Throughout the years of the Third Reich's rise and consolidation, Ilse Hess was a devoted and ideologically committed supporter of the regime. She was not a passive political wife content to remain in the background. She was a genuine, true believer who shared her husband's fervent National Socialist convictions and who remained loyal to those convictions long after the evidence of the regime's true nature had become inescapable. Her loyalty was tested in dramatic fashion on May 10, 1941, when Rudolf Hess climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf 110 at Augsburg and flew alone across the North Sea to Scotland, where he parachuted into a Scottish field and was taken prisoner by a local farmer. His stated intention had been to negotiate a private peace agreement between Germany and Britain, bypassing Hitler entirely. The reaction in Berlin was one of humiliation and fury. Hitler, who apparently knew nothing of the mission, declared Hess mentally ill and had him struck from the official Nazi succession. For Ilse, the episode was devastating in its immediate consequences, but did nothing to shake her fundamental beliefs. She staunchly defended her husband's intentions and continued to stand by both him and the party through the catastrophe of Germany's defeat. When the war ended and the Allied forces began the process of identifying and interning those connected to the Nazi leadership, Ilse Hess was among those arrested. She was sent to an internment camp in Augsburg, where she remained for a period before eventually being released. Rudolf Hess, meanwhile, stood trial at the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal alongside the other surviving senior Nazi leaders. He was convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy and sentenced to life imprisonment to be served at Spandau prison in West Berlin. This extraordinary sentence, which meant that Hess would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, also defined the remainder of Ilse's existence. She devoted the post-war decades to the campaign for her husband's release, writing letters, giving interviews, lobbying politicians, and maintaining an unwavering public insistence on his innocence and the injustice of his continued imprisonment. When she was eventually freed from internment, she moved to the Allgäu region of Bavaria, and by 1955 had opened a boarding house there, creating a modest income from an unlikely vocation. Ilse's post-war life was marked not by any renunciation of her beliefs, but by an unbroken continuity of ideology. She remained a steadfast believer in National Socialism and kept her devotion to Adolf Hitler and his worldview essentially intact until the end of her life. She became a supporter of Stille Hilfe, the secret organization founded to provide practical assistance to arrested, condemned, and fugitive members of the SS, channeling funds and emotional support to men whose crimes were often beyond dispute. In 1952, she published a controversial memoir and collection of letters titled England, Nürnberg, Spandau, Ein Schicksal in Briefen, which presented her husband's story entirely from a sympathetic Nazi perspective and which attracted correspondence among the most committed Hitler admirers still operating in post-war Germany. Rudolf Hess remained in Spandau prison until August 17, 1987, when he was found dead in his prison cell at the age of 93, the apparent victim of suicide by asphyxiation using an electrical cord. The circumstances of his death have been the subject of conspiracy theories ever since, many of them promoted by Ilse herself and by their son Wolf Rüdiger, who claimed the evidence pointed to murder by British intelligence. Ilse Hess outlived her husband by 8 years, dying on September 7, 1995, at the age of 95. She had never acknowledged any wrongdoing, had never expressed any regret, and had remained to the very last a committed adherent to the ideology that had caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. From the determined ideological loyalty of Ilse Hess, we move to the glittering and somewhat more complicated world of Emmy Goering, the woman who styled herself the First Lady of the Third Reich, and who made that claim with an imperial confidence that reportedly drove Eva Braun to fury. Emmy Johanna Sonnemann was born on March 24, 1893, in Hamburg, the daughter of a prosperous merchant family. Unlike many of the women in this story, Emmy had a genuine professional career before she entered the orbit of the Nazi leadership. She was an actress of real accomplishment, performing in theatres across Germany for over 2 decades and building a reputation in the German theatrical world that was independent of any political connection. It was in 1932 that she first met Hermann Goering, at the time one of the most powerful men in the Nazi Party and soon to be one of the most powerful in Germany. Goering was a man of overwhelming physical presence and personality, a war hero decorated with the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honour, a compulsive collector of art and luxury, and a man of appetite so enormous in every direction that observers sometimes struggled to process him as a real person. His first wife, the Swedish Baroness Karin von Kantzow, had died in 1931, leaving him devastated. Emmy, elegant, professionally accomplished, and utterly comfortable in the grand social world that Goering was beginning to construct around himself, was exactly what he was looking for. The relationship developed over 2 years of courtship, and on April 10, 1935, they married in Berlin in a ceremony attended by Hitler himself and accompanied by a military flyover that Goering had arranged as a personal touch of theatre. Interestingly, Emmy was not initially a member of the Nazi Party. This was remedied in 1938 when the party membership was presented to her as a Christmas gift, a detail that captures something of the strange mixture of ceremony, coercion, and casual inclusion that characterized life in the Nazi elite. Emmy took to her role as First Lady of the Third Reich with genuine enthusiasm and considerable skill. She presided over state functions at Karinhall, the enormous estate north of Berlin that Goering had named for his first wife, a palace of looted art and extraordinary opulence that became one of the great social centres of the Nazi world. Hitler himself made regular visits. Foreign dignitaries were dazzled by its collections and its scale. Emmy moved through all of it with the professional ease of a woman who had spent her working life performing. Her self-proclaimed status as the First Lady of the Reich brought her into sharp and sometimes openly hostile conflict with Eva Braun. Emmy openly disregarded Eva, treating her with a condescension that reflected the fact that, unlike Eva, Emmy was actually visible. She appeared at official events, she was photographed with dignitaries, she was publicly acknowledged as the wife of the man who was for a time regarded as Hitler's most likely successor. Hitler was obliged on more than one occasion to intervene in the conflict between the two women, instructing Goering to make his wife treat Eva Braun with the respect her position demanded. The consequence was that Emmy found herself excluded from the Berghof, Hitler's Bavarian retreat, where Eva was the unchallenged mistress of the household. Emmy's world was grander and more public than Eva's, but ultimately no less constrained by the requirements of male vanity and political calculation. When the war ended and Hermann Goering was taken prisoner by American forces, Emmy faced a dramatic reversal of fortune. A German denazification court examined her case and found her guilty of being an active Nazi, which she was. The consequences were real, if not crushing. She was sentenced to a year in prison, which she served, and upon release found that 30% of the wealth she had accumulated during the Nazi years had been confiscated. She was also banned from performing on stage for 5 years, cutting off the professional outlet that had been her identity before the war. The apartment she managed to secure for herself in Munich after her release was, by the standards of the life she had lived at Karinhall, barely imaginable. Hermann Goering himself had escaped a Nuremberg death sentence by swallowing a cyanide capsule on October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, in an act of defiance that Emmy apparently regarded with the mixed emotion of pride in his final act of will and grief at his death. She wrote a memoir of her life with him titled My Life with Goering, which offered her perspective on their years together with the characteristic combination of self-justification and genuine loss that mark the memoirs of so many Nazi wives. Emmy Goering died in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80, outliving most of the remarkable and terrible company she had once kept. The story of Margaret Himmler, the wife of the man who built and commanded the apparatus of the Holocaust itself, begins with what might seem like an irony, but perhaps illustrates something important about the moral corruption that the Nazi regime required of everyone it touched. Margaret Boden was born in 1893 and trained as a nurse, a profession dedicated by its entire nature to the preservation of life and the relief of suffering. After the First World War, she worked at the German Red Cross Hospital and, with financial support from her father, managed a private nursing clinic. It was during one of Heinrich Himmler's lecture tours in 1927 that she first encountered the man who was then beginning his rise through the SS hierarchy. Himmler was immediately attracted to her, captivated specifically by her blue eyes and blonde hair, which corresponded neatly to the racial ideals he would later help to codify as state policy. Despite some initial family resistance, primarily from Himmler's Catholic family, who objected to her Protestant faith and to the age difference between them, as well as to her status as a divorcee, they married in July 1928. Their daughter Gudrun was born on August 8, 1929. Margaret was far from a passive presence in the world her husband was constructing. She joined the Nazi Party in 1928 and threw herself into the social obligations of her position, regularly organising gatherings for the wives of senior SS leaders and aligning herself publicly with the regime her husband was building into an instrument of mass murder. Despite her evident enthusiasm, she was notably unpopular among the other Nazi wives. At the 1938 Nuremberg rally, she found herself in such open conflict with the other women that they collectively refused to follow her lead, a remarkable act of social defiance within a hierarchy that normally demanded perfect conformity. By the end of 1939, Margaret had taken on formal responsibilities within the Red Cross structure, overseeing hospitals throughout the Berlin-Brandenburg region. Her role took her on missions to occupied territories, and she documented what she saw there without the slightest apparent disturbance to her conscience. In a diary entry from March 1940, she described a trip through Poland under German occupation, in terms that are as revealing as they are repellent, expressing disgust at the Jewish and Polish population she encountered, and satisfaction with the German project of imposing order on what she described as indescribable dirt. The personal relationship between Margaret and Heinrich Himmler collapsed privately well before the public collapse of the regime they had helped to build. In 1941, Margaret discovered that her husband had been carrying on a secret affair with his personal secretary, Hedwig Potthast, with whom he would have 2 children. The marriage effectively ended at that point, though Margaret continued to occupy her public role and to correspond with her husband's family in terms that suggest she had not entirely processed the scale of her own humiliation. In February 1945, as the war was clearly lost, she wrote to Heinrich's brother Gebhard, describing her husband with an admiration that now reads as wholly disconnected from reality. Himmler himself was captured by British forces after Germany's surrender, disguised in civilian clothes and attempting to escape. On May 23, 1945, in a British internment camp at Lüneburg, he bit down on a cyanide capsule concealed in his mouth and was dead within minutes. For Margaret, the post-war process of denazification was lengthy and initially inconclusive. She subjected herself to multiple investigations probing the extent of her knowledge of her husband's activities and consistently denied any awareness of the nature or scale of the crimes he had directed. The claim was difficult to sustain given the level of her social involvement with the SS hierarchy, but the denazification tribunals were not courts of criminal law, and the standard of evidence required to establish guilt was not always met. After prolonged deliberation that stretched until 1953, she was ultimately classified as a profiteer of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 30 days of penal labour. She was additionally stripped of her voting rights and her eligibility for a pension, concrete material consequences that nonetheless fell far short of any proportionate accounting for her years of cheerful participation in the world the SS had created. After serving her sentence, she adopted the pseudonym Marguerite Bouden and spent the remainder of her life attempting to distance herself from her past. She died in 1967. Having managed to construct a quiet anonymity that would have seemed impossible for the wife of the man who was, arguably, Hitler's most important and most terrible collaborator. Lina von Osten was born on June 14, 1911, into a family with strong nationalist convictions, and she absorbed the politics of the German right from an early age through her brother Hans, an ardent member of both the Nazi Party and the SA, whose passionate advocacy for the movement led Lina herself to attend a rally in 1929 at which she heard Adolf Hitler speak for the first time. The experience transformed her. She joined the Nazi Party soon afterward, and it was through the social world of the movement that she attended a rowing club ball in Kiel in late 1930 at the age of 19, where she met a striking and intensely driven young naval lieutenant named Reinhard Heydrich. The attraction was immediate and mutual, and the couple became engaged on December 18, 1930. But the path to their marriage was complicated almost immediately. In 1931, Heydrich was brought before a naval honour court on charges of conduct unbecoming to an officer, arising from his treatment of a young woman to whom he had promised marriage before his engagement to Lina. The court dismissed him from the Navy in April of that year, leaving him without career or income. It was Lina who, at this critical moment, pointed him toward the possibility of a future in the newly establishing SS. She suggested he apply for a position, coached him on what to say when he met Heinrich Himmler, and effectively launched the career that would make Reinhard Heydrich one of the most feared men in Europe. Heydrich's proposal to Himmler for an SS intelligence service was adopted immediately. Himmler appointed him to build and lead what would become the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, the intelligence arm of the SS that would grow into one of the principal instruments of Nazi terror. Within a few years, Heydrich had accumulated enormous power, running not only the SD but also the Gestapo, and eventually serving as the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, where his methods were so brutal that he was known as the Hangman of Prague. For his wife's loyalty and contribution to his rise, Hitler personally rewarded Lina with a large estate in rural Bohemia, a grant of property confiscated from its previous owners that placed Lina in an extraordinary position of power within the occupied Czech lands. At this estate, the evidence suggests Lina was not a passive beneficiary. Several prisoners were held there for forced labour, and credible accounts describe her physically abusing those workers, an accusation that has never been satisfactorily resolved in legal proceedings, but which has formed a persistent part of her historical record. The Heydrich family was still living in Bohemia in May 1942 when Reinhard Heydrich was mortally wounded in an ambush by Czech resistance fighters trained by the British Special Operations Executive. He died of his wounds on June 4, 1942, at the age of 38. His assassins were subsequently hunted down and killed, and the Nazis took catastrophic revenge on the Czech village of Lidis, destroying it completely and murdering most of its male population. Lina and the children evacuated Bohemia in April 1945 as Soviet forces approached, joining the general German flight westward. After World War II ended, Lina's case went through the denazification proceedings that processed hundreds of thousands of Germans, and she emerged from that process acquitted, a verdict that surprised and outraged many observers given the nature of her husband's activities and the specific accusations against her at the Bohemian estate. Through persistent legal battles against the West German government in 1956 and again in 1959, she managed to secure a widow's pension, a deeply contentious outcome. Given that she was the widow of the man who had been one of the principal architects of the Holocaust and who had chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, at which the final solution was officially coordinated. Despite the fact that a Czechoslovakian court had convicted her in absentia and sentenced her to life imprisonment for her activities in occupied Bohemia, she successfully avoided serving that sentence by remaining in West Germany, which did not extradite its citizens to communist countries. In 1965, on a vacation trip to Finland, she met a Finnish theatre director named Mauno Manninen and married him, a move she acknowledged was motivated primarily by the desire to change her surname and shed the identification with her first husband that continued to follow her. She converted the former Heydrich summer house on the island of Fehmarn into a restaurant and inn, running it until an accidental fire destroyed the building. In 1976, she published a memoir, Life with a War. Criminal, in which she simultaneously acknowledged Heydrich's crimes through the title and then spent 300 pages defending his reputation, painting him as a misunderstood idealist who had been unfairly demonized by history. She continued to argue this case until her death on August 14, 1985, at the age of 74, unrepentant to the last. Annelies Heinrich was born on January 11, 1896, in Pforzheim, and she came to her marriage with Joachim von Ribbentrop through a connection that shaped everything that followed. Her father, Otto Henkel, was the head of a prosperous sparkling wine business, one of the leading Sekt producers in Germany, and it was from this comfortable commercial background that Annelies brought to her marriage not only a substantial inheritance, but also the business connections and social polish that helped her husband establish himself in the elite circles of German society. She married Joachim von Ribbentrop in 1920, and for the next decade, the couple lived the life of prosperous wine merchants, Ribbentrop having entered the family business. It was Annelies who, by most accounts, was the more politically engaged of the two in the early years of their Nazi involvement, and there is a credible historical tradition that it was she who brought her husband to the attention of the Nazi movement and who encouraged his cultivation of connections with Hitler's circle. Whether or not that precise claim is accurate, there is no doubt that Annelies was a genuine enthusiast for the regime that her husband would serve as foreign minister from 1938 until the war's end. Ribbentrop's rise was remarkable. A man of limited intelligence who compensated for his intellectual deficiencies with an extraordinary social brazenness and a talent for self-promotion, he cultivated Hitler's attention in the early 1930s by making his Berlin villa available for secret meetings between Hitler and German establishment figures who were not yet ready to be seen publicly fraternizing with the Nazi leadership. This service proved invaluable. Hitler rewarded Ribbentrop with increasing diplomatic responsibilities, appointing him as ambassador to Britain in 1936 and then as foreign minister in 1938, positions for which virtually all serious observers agreed he was catastrophically unsuited. The British political establishment found Ribbentrop so insufferably arrogant and obtuse that he became one of the most disliked foreign representatives London had ever received. Winston Churchill described him as the most disagreeable foreigner he had ever encountered. Annelies accompanied him through all of this, playing the role of diplomatic wife with the social confidence of a woman who had been raised in comfort and who now found herself at the centre of European history. She also shared, without apparent reservation, her husband's fanatical anti-Semitism and his absolute devotion to Hitler. She was, if anything, more rigidly ideological than he was, which was saying something considerable. What happened to Annelies after Germany's defeat was a direct consequence of her husband's fate. Ribbentrop was one of the 21 senior Nazi defendants tried at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and his trial was one of the most damning. He was convicted on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. On October 16, 1946, Joachim von Ribbentrop was hanged, the first of the Nuremberg condemned to be executed that night. Annelies herself was subjected to denazification proceedings in the post-war years and was classified among those most deeply implicated in the Nazi regime. She was stripped of most of the considerable wealth the family had accumulated during the Nazi years. She spent the post-war decades working on what became a lengthy and persistent campaign to rehabilitate her husband's reputation, commissioning research, corresponding with historians and politicians, and writing memoirs and defences of his record that found an audience only among those who were already convinced of his innocence. She died in 1973, having spent nearly 3 decades trying to rewrite a history that had already rendered its verdict with considerable finality. The story of Gerda Bormann is among the strangest in this collection, because it is the story of a woman who was devoted to a man whose fate, after the war, remained one of the great unresolved mysteries of the 20th century for decades. Gerda Buch was born on October 23, 1909, the daughter of Walter Buch, a senior Nazi official who served as chief judge of the Nazi Party court. Her pedigree within the movement was therefore impeccable from the very beginning, and her marriage on September 2, 1929 to Martin Bormann, then a rising figure in the party hierarchy, cemented her position at the inner core of the Nazi world. Bormann was not a glamorous figure in the way that Goering or Heydrich were. He was a thick-set, uncharismatic bureaucrat whose power derived entirely from his extraordinary talent for administration, his total reliability as an executor of Hitler's wishes, and his genius for positioning himself as the essential intermediary between the Führer and everyone else who wanted access to him. By the end of the war, Martin Bormann was arguably the most powerful man in Germany after Hitler himself, controlling access to the Führer and wielding that control with the ruthlessness of a true political operator. Gerda was, by all accounts, genuinely devoted to her husband and to the ideology he served. The couple had 10 children together, a fact that was celebrated in Nazi propaganda as a model of the Germanic family ideal. Bormann himself was not faithful in the way that ideology demanded of others, maintaining an open affair with the actress Manja Behrens that he somehow persuaded his wife to accept, at one point suggesting in extraordinary correspondence that Gerda and Manja should alternate living with him so that he could enjoy the benefits of both relationships simultaneously. Gerda appears to have responded to this proposal with a disturbing compliance, explaining in letters to her husband that she understood his needs and wished him happiness, even in this unusual arrangement. This submission tells us something important about the psychological environment that the Nazi cult of male authority had created even within the most intimate domestic spaces. Gerda contracted tuberculosis during the war years, and her health deteriorated severely. After Germany's defeat, she was interned by Allied authorities along with several of their children. Martin Bormann's fate remained unknown for decades. He had been present in the Führer bunker until the last days, and eyewitness accounts described him attempting to flee through Soviet lines in the chaos of early May 1945. Some witnesses believed he had been killed. Others were convinced he had escaped to South America. The mystery persisted for more than 25 years. Gerda Bormann died in Murano, Italy in March 1946 of tuberculosis, before the mystery of her husband's fate had been resolved. She never knew what had become of him. It was not until 1972 when construction workers in Berlin unearthed human remains near the Lehrter railway station, and not until 1998, when DNA analysis confirmed the identification, that it was established that Martin Bormann had died in Berlin in early May 1945, most likely by suicide when escape became impossible. Gerda Bormann had carried her devotion to a man who had been dead for months when she herself died, and the truth about his end had to wait half a century to be confirmed. Henriette von Schirach occupies a somewhat different position in this gallery of women, because her story includes something that most of the others conspicuously lack, a moment of genuine moral conscience that placed her in direct confrontation with Adolf Hitler himself. Henriette Hoffmann was born on February 3, 1913, the daughter of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official personal photographer and one of the most intimate members of the Führer's personal circle. She had known Hitler since early childhood, calling him Uncle Adolf, and she was one of the very few people in Germany who had genuine personal access to him, that predated and was independent of political calculation. She married Baldur von Schirach, the head of the Hitler Youth, in 1932, forming a union of two of the regime's most prominent younger figures. Baldur von Schirach was a genuine true believer who had written devotional poems to Hitler in his youth and who administered the Hitler Youth Organization with a combination of organizational competence and ideological fanaticism that made it one of the most effective instruments of political socialization in the Nazi state. He was appointed Gauleiter and Reich Governor of Vienna in 1940, and it was there, overseeing the deportation of Austrian Jews to the death camps in the East, that he added crimes against humanity to his record. But it was Henriette who created the extraordinary scene that has defined her place in history. In 1943, having witnessed the rounding up of Dutch Jews in Amsterdam during a trip to the Netherlands, she raised the subject directly with Hitler at the Berghof, describing what she had seen and expressing her distress at the treatment of the Jewish women she had watched being dragged from their homes. Hitler's response was volcanic in its fury. He told her that she was sentimental, that she did not understand the necessities of wartime, and he effectively expelled her from his social circle on the spot. She and Baldur were subsequently banished from the Berghof and never invited back. The account of this encounter, which Henriette later described in her memoirs and in interviews, has been subject to historical scrutiny and some debate about its precise details, but the core elements are well documented and represent one of the very few instances of any member of the Nazi inner circle speaking directly to Hitler about the persecution of the Jews in a way that could be construed as critical. Whether Henriette's protest constituted genuine moral courage, or whether it was a limited and belated response that falls well short of any real resistance, is a judgment that different historians have reached differently. What is not disputed is that it cost her something real and that she paid a social price for saying what she said. At the war's end, Baldur von Schirach was tried at Nuremberg and convicted of crimes against humanity for his role in the deportation of Viennese Jews. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which he served in full at Spandau, being released in 1966. The marriage did not survive the decades of separation. Henriette and Baldur divorced after his release. Henriette spent the post-war decades writing about her experiences in the Nazi world, publishing memoirs that attempted to present her own story as that of someone who had been swept up in events beyond her understanding and control, and who had, when the moment came, found the moral courage to speak. Critics noted that this self-presentation glossed over years of enthusiastic participation in and benefit from a regime whose crimes were not, by any honest reading of the evidence, unknown to those who moved in its inner circles. Henriette von Schirach died on January 27, 1992, at the age of 78. The case of Brigitte Frank, the wife of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, who was known as the Butcher of Poland, illuminates the question of how women who benefited from extraordinary crimes managed, in many instances, to absorb and enjoy those benefits without apparently troubling themselves too greatly about their origins. Our Hans Frank was a lawyer by training who became one of Hitler's most fervent supporters in the early days of the movement, and who was rewarded after the conquest of Poland with the governorship of the General Government, the portion of occupied Poland that was not directly annexed into the Reich. From his headquarters in the Wawel Castle in Krakow, Frank presided over an occupation characterized by savage brutality, mass starvation, forced labor, and the systematic murder of the Jewish population, who represented approximately 10% of the territory's total population at the time of occupation. He was an enthusiastic and vocal participant in the planning and execution of the final solution in his territory. But he also created for himself, his family and his associates a life of extraordinary luxury amid the ruins, commandeering the royal apartments at Wawel, filling them with art looted from Polish collections, and hosting lavish parties for the Nazi elite while the people outside the castle walls were starving and dying. Brigitte Frank accompanied her husband to Poland and participated in this life of looted luxury with no apparent discomfort. She was known for her extravagance and for her willingness to profit from the confiscation of property and goods from the Jewish population. When Hans Frank was tried at Nuremberg, convicted on counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death, Brigitte faced the prospect of a post-war life stripped of everything the Nazi years had provided. Frank was hanged on October 16, 1946. Brigitte was subjected to denazification proceedings and had a significant portion of whatever wealth remained seized. She spent the post-war decades in relative obscurity in Bavaria, and the question of what she understood, what she witnessed, and what she chose to ignore during the years in the Wawel Castle has never been satisfactorily resolved. Her son, Nicholas Frank, who was born in 1939 and grew up in the Governor-General's household, later wrote a searing and remarkable memoir titled In the Shadow of the Reich, in which he described his parents in terms of unsparing condemnation, calling his father a murderer and his mother complicit in his crimes. The book caused considerable controversy in Germany, both for its content and for the extremity of its author's rejection of his parents. Brigitte Frank died in 1981, and the full measure of what she knew and when she knew it died with her. What would you do if you found yourself in the position of these women, embedded in the machinery of a regime committing crimes on a scale history had never seen, surrounded by privilege purchased with blood? The answer for almost all of them was to look away and hold tighter to what they had. But there were a very few, and Unity Mitford was certainly one of the strangest of them, who came to the Nazi world entirely from outside it, drawn not by marriage or family obligation, but by something that looked disturbingly like genuine ideological passion. Unity Valkyrie Freeman Mitford was born on August 8, 1914 in London, the fourth of the six remarkable Mitford sisters whose various enthusiasms, from communism to fascism, from country life to the literary avant-garde, made them one of the most discussed families in pre-war Britain. Unity's passion was for Germany and for Adolf Hitler specifically. She travelled to Munich in 1934 with the explicit stated intention of meeting the Führer. She sat in the same restaurant as him, the Osteria Bavaria on the Schillingstrasse, day after day until he noticed her, which he did in February 1935, inviting her to join his table. What followed was a relationship of extraordinary intensity and political importance. Hitler was genuinely fond of Unity, perhaps because she represented something he found deeply satisfying. A member of the British aristocracy who had come to worship him of her own free will, who shared his political worldview, and whose personal beauty and social position seemed to validate the attraction of National Socialism to minds of quality. He gave her access to his company that was extraordinary for a foreign national, introducing her to senior Nazi officials, inviting her to official events, and spending considerable personal time with her. Unity attended the Nuremberg rallies, was present at the Anschluss celebrations in Vienna, and associated closely with figures including Julius Streicher, whose violent anti-Semitism she shared openly, writing letters to Der Stürmer praising the paper's work. Her family in Britain was divided between horror and awkward acceptance. Her sister Diana had married Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, and the Mitford clan therefore encompassed within itself a remarkable spectrum of political extremism. When war between Britain and Germany became inevitable in September 1939, Unity was in Munich and faced a crisis that her years of devotion had not prepared her to handle. On September 3, 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, she walked to the Englischer Garten in central Munich and shot herself in the head with a small pistol that Hitler had given her as a gift. The suicide attempt did not succeed. Unity Mitford lay in a Munich clinic for months, the bullet lodged in her skull in a position that surgeons deemed too dangerous to remove. Hitler visited her and arranged for her medical care, and in January 1940 he personally facilitated her repatriation to Britain via neutral Switzerland, paying for the entire operation himself. She arrived back in Britain a changed woman. The bullet had caused significant brain damage, affecting her memory, her personality, and her capacity for the kind of brittle social engagement that had characterized her pre-war life. She was physically and cognitively diminished, moving back into her family's care and spending the remaining years of her life in declining health. She died on May 28, 1948, at the age of 33 of meningitis brought on by the swelling around the bullet that had remained in her brain for nearly 9 years. Whether the bullet finally moved or whether the damage it had always been causing simply reached a terminal stage is not entirely clear from the medical record. What is clear is that Unity Mitford had dedicated her most vital years to a regime she found glorious and that had returned the favour by allowing a war to begin that destroyed the world she had tried to inhabit. Before we continue with the other remarkable women in this story, we should briefly acknowledge one of the most poignant and disturbing of all the figures connected to Hitler's personal world, Angelika Maria Raubal, known as Geli, who was Hitler's niece and who occupied a position in his life that has been the subject of speculation, controversy, and genuine historical investigation ever since her death in 1931. Geli was born on June 4, 1908, to Hitler's half-sister Angela Raubal and her husband Leo Raubal. She was therefore Hitler's niece by half-blood, and when Angela Raubal became the housekeeper at the Berghof in the mid-1920s, Geli came to spend increasing amounts of time in her uncle's company. The exact nature of the relationship between Geli and Hitler has been debated by historians for nearly a century. What is documented beyond reasonable dispute is that Hitler became intensely possessive of his niece, controlling her social life, her friendships, her movements, and her romantic relationships to a degree that even those within the Nazi circle found excessive and disturbing. He moved her into an apartment in Munich that was adjacent to his own, financed her studies, and appears to have made her feel simultaneously privileged and imprisoned. Several accounts from people who knew her describe a young woman who laughed easily and had a lively natural temperament that was being progressively ground down by the weight of her uncle's attention. On September 18, 1931, Geli Raubal was found dead in Hitler's Munich apartment with a bullet wound to the chest from Hitler's own pistol. Hitler himself had left Munich the previous day. The death was ruled a suicide, and the official explanation was that Geli had become despondent over her relationship with a man in Vienna whom Hitler had forbidden her to see. The investigation was extremely brief, and given the political context, the convenience of a suicide verdict was not lost on observers at the time. Rumours of murder circulated immediately and have never entirely disappeared from the historical literature, though the weight of serious scholarly opinion has generally accepted that the death was indeed suicide. What is not disputed is that Geli's death had a devastating effect on Hitler. By all accounts, she was the closest thing to genuine emotional attachment that the most destructive man of the 20th century ever experienced, and her loss caused him a grief that those around him found both authentic and alarming. He kept her room at the Berghof exactly as it had been during her lifetime, displayed her portrait in his private quarters, and spoke of her throughout the remaining years of his life. The apartment in Munich where she died became a kind of private shrine. It is one of history's bleaker ironies that the man who ordered the deaths of millions appears to have been capable of genuine mourning for one particular loss. Now we turn to the woman who was perhaps the most powerful in terms of her behind-the-scenes influence, yet who remains one of the least well-known outside of serious historical circles. Hedwig Potthast, Heinrich Himmler's secretary and long-term mistress, who bore him 2 children and who quietly shaped aspects of the most powerful police state in European history from a position of studied invisibility. Hedwig Potthast was born on February 24, 1912, in Cologne. She began working as Himmler's personal secretary in 1936, and by 1939 their relationship had moved well beyond the professional. Himmler, who publicly professed absolute fidelity to the ideals of the SS man as a moral exemplar, was conducting a sustained affair with his employee while remaining nominally married to Margaret. When Margaret discovered the relationship in 1941, the marriage was effectively over, though Himmler chose not to formally divorce, in part because Hitler disapproved of senior Nazi leaders abandoning their wives, and in part because the appearance of domestic stability was useful politically. Hedwig and Himmler established a separate household, and she bore him a son, Helga, in February 1942, and a daughter, Nanette Dorothea, in July 1944. Hedwig Potthast was therefore not merely a peripheral figure in Himmler's personal life. She was his actual domestic partner for the final 5 years of his life and the mother of 2 of his children. Her position gave her a kind of influence that was invisible, but real. She accompanied him on some of his official travels and was present in the immediate circle around him during the final months of the war. She was not tried for any crimes after Germany's defeat, and the denazification process did not result in any significant penalty for her. She raised her 2 children in the post-war years in circumstances of genuine difficulty. having been stripped of whatever resources the relationship with Himmler had provided and left to manage alone after his suicide in May 1945. The two children she bore with Himmler had a complex and painful legacy to navigate. Helga Potthast and his sister Nanette Dorothea Potthast grew up bearing a surname that concealed their parentage from casual scrutiny, which appears to have been exactly the point. Hedwig Potthast died on December 1, 1994, at the age of 82, having spent nearly 5 decades building a quiet life far from the terrible centre where she had once been so close to the heart of things. Now we come to the wife of the man who was perhaps the most ideologically extreme of all the senior Nazi leaders, with the exception of Hitler himself. Julius Streicher was the publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, a publication so extreme in its hatred, so graphic in its depictions of Jewish people, and so explicit in its calls for their persecution that even some senior Nazis found it distasteful, though not distasteful enough to suppress it. Streicher's first wife, Kunigunde Roth, had died in 1943, and in February 1945, with Germany already in its death throes, Streicher married Adele Tapper, who had been his personal secretary. Adele Streicher was a committed ideological partner who shared her husband's violent anti-Semitism and who had worked alongside him for years in the production of a newspaper that historians have described as one of the most important instruments of anti-Semitic radicalization in Nazi Germany. When Streicher was arrested by American forces in May 1945, found hiding in the Austrian Tyrol wearing a fake identity as a painter named Joseph Saylor, Adele faced the consequences of having bound her fate to one of the most irredeemably vicious figures in the entire Nazi leadership. Streicher was tried at Nuremberg and convicted of crimes against humanity on the basis of his role in inciting genocide through his decades of published hatred. He was hanged on October 16, 1946, famously shouting Heil Hitler from the scaffold in his last moment. Adele survived him, living with the burden of that legacy for decades in obscurity. The case of Margaret Speer, known as Annie, the wife of Albert Speer, the regime's chief architect and armaments minister, is in some ways one of the most fascinating in this entire story because of what it reveals about the mechanisms of self-deception available to people who are genuinely intelligent and who choose, nonetheless, not to see. Albert Speer was the one senior Nazi official who, at Nuremberg, successfully presented himself as a reasonable, cultivated, essentially apolitical technocrat who had served the regime's practical needs without knowledge of its criminal depths. This defense was almost certainly a sustained and sophisticated lie. Speer was well aware of the deportation of Jewish workers for forced labor in his armaments ministry, was present at Himmler's Posen speech in October 1943, in which the extermination of the Jewish people was explicitly described, and had every access to information about the Holocaust that his position and intelligence would have ensured he processed. But at Nuremberg, he performed the role of the good German technocrat with such discipline and tactical intelligence that he was sentenced to 20 years, rather than death, a verdict that outraged the Soviet judges and has troubled historians ever since. Annie Speer, born in 1902, married Albert in 1928. They had 6 children together. Throughout the Nazi years, she occupied the conventional role of senior Nazi wife with quiet efficiency, living in the comfortable circumstances that her husband's extraordinary career made available, moving in the elite social circles of the Reich and raising her children in the world that the Nazi leadership had constructed. After Speer's conviction at Nuremberg, Annie waited through the 20 years of his imprisonment at Spandau, a loyalty that was tested by revelations about the nature of the regime he had served and about the level of his personal knowledge of its crimes. When Speer was released from Spandau on September 30, 1966, having served every day of his sentence, he emerged as a figure of considerable public interest, a senior Nazi who had been educated, intelligent, charming, and who had survived. He published his memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, in 1969, which became a bestseller around the world and which maintained the fiction of the innocent technocrat with great literary skill. The marriage survived his imprisonment but was strained by the revelations of his post-war years, including an emotional relationship with a much younger woman that became publicly known. Annie Speer died in 1987. Having watched her husband's carefully constructed post-war reputation begin to collapse under the weight of increasingly rigorous historical scrutiny that demonstrated the extent and nature of his knowledge of and participation in the Holocaust. At this point in our journey through the fates of the women who stood closest to the Nazi leadership, it is worth pausing to consider a broader question. What do these individual stories tell us about the moral landscape of the Third Reich and about the specific position that women occupied within it? The answer is complicated because the women in this story were not a uniform type. Some were ideological fanatics who believed in National Socialism as deeply and as completely as any of the men they married. Others were opportunists who understood the political dimensions of the world they inhabited, but whose primary motivation was the comfort, status, and security that proximity to power provided. A very few were women who harboured private doubts that they were never in a position to act upon, but almost none of them were truly innocent bystanders, swept up by forces they could not understand or resist. They had choices, and the choices they made tell us something important about the nature of complicity and about the way that ordinary human motivations, ambition, vanity, love, loyalty, cowardice can be marshalled in the service of extraordinary evil. With that reflection in mind, let us continue. Ingeborg Sauckel was the wife of Fritz Sauckel, the man appointed by Hitler in March 1942 as plenipotentiary general for labour deployment, which meant in practice that Sauckel was responsible for the forced conscription of millions of workers from occupied territories across Europe to serve as slave labour in German industry. This was an enormous criminal enterprise conducted on a scale that left the Nuremberg tribunal almost breathless in its scope. Sauckel recruited or seized approximately 5 million foreign workers during his tenure, the vast majority of them through methods that were coercive, brutal, and in most cases constituted crimes against humanity under any reasonable definition. He was, in the language of the Nuremberg judgment, responsible for one of the greatest and most ruthless mass transfers of human beings in history. Ingeborg Sauckel had married Fritz in 1923 when he was an obscure sailor and party activist with no particular prospects. Together, they had 10 children, and Ingeborg committed herself fully to the domestic and public requirements of her husband's position. When Sauckel was arrested by Allied forces and tried at Nuremberg, the contrast between his actual record and his courtroom demeanour was striking. He presented himself as a simple working man who had done his duty, who had never intended any harm, and who had simply organised the labour that the Reich's war economy required. The tribunal was not persuaded. He was convicted on all 4 counts and hanged on October 16, 1946. Ingeborg was left with the burden of 10 children and the knowledge of what their father had been convicted of doing. She navigated the post-war years in Bavaria with the particular combination of grief, denial, and practical necessity that characterized the widows of executed Nazi war criminals. Few fates in this story are as straightforwardly bitter as that of the wives of the men who were hanged at Nuremberg, and there were quite a few of them. The wives of Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, and Alfred Jodl, his immediate subordinate, faced particularly pointed post-war circumstances because both men were found guilty on all 4 counts at Nuremberg and were executed on the same night, October 16, 1946. Lise Keitel had been married to the Field Marshal since 1919, a union that had survived 3 decades of German military politics and had brought her into the company of the very highest levels of the armed forces. Keitel was notoriously known among his own officers as Lack-Ittel, a contemptuous pun on the German word for lackey, reflecting their assessment of his subservient relationship with Hitler. He signed orders that condemned prisoners of war and civilian hostages to death, transmitted the criminal orders of the regime to the Wehrmacht without resistance, and presided over a military command structure that bore significant responsibility for the atrocities committed by German forces across Europe. Lise Keitel was spared any formal criminal prosecution, but lived with the weight of her husband's conviction and execution, retreating into the private life of a widow in post-war West Germany. The second wife of Alfred Jodl, Louise von Bender, who had married him in 1944 while he was still serving as chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, found herself widowed by his execution at the age of 38. Louise was a remarkable woman in her own right, by contemporary accounts intelligent and perceptive, and she dedicated significant energy in the post-war years to the posthumous rehabilitation of her husband's reputation. She was largely successful, at least within Germany, where a West German denazification court in 1953 did indeed posthumously acquit Jodl of the criminal charges, a verdict that caused considerable international controversy and was never accepted by any of the Allied powers that had participated in his trial. Louise Jodl continued to argue her husband's case for decades, producing written defences of his record and maintaining that he had been a professional military officer who had carried out his duties within the law of armed conflict, a characterisation that the historical record supports only very partially. The fate of Erna Grun, who became the wife of Field Marshal Erna von Blomberg in January 1938, and whose past precipitated one of the great scandals of the early Nazi military, is not the story of a woman. Deeply embedded in the Nazi leadership, but it is one of the most consequential stories involving any woman in the entire history of the Third Reich. Blomberg was the commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht and the Reich Minister of War, the senior military figure in Germany, and his marriage to a young woman significantly below his social station caused immediate eyebrows. It was shortly after the wedding that the Gestapo discovered and reported to Goering and then to Hitler that Erna Grun had a police record for prostitution and had appeared in pornographic photographs. The scandal that followed destroyed Blomberg's career on the spot and provided the pretext for the simultaneous dismissal of the army commander-in-chief, Werner von Fritsch, on trumped-up charges of homosexuality. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair, as it became known, allowed Hitler to restructure the German military command to his advantage, bringing the Wehrmacht directly under his personal control through the new Oberkommando der Wehrmacht structure. The entire edifice of this reshaping of the German military command, with its enormous consequences for the conduct of the coming war, rested in part on the existence and discovery of a young woman's past, which had been known to Goering before the marriage and had been, some historians argue, deliberately exploited to create exactly this crisis. Erna Blomberg, née Grun, was the unwitting instrument of a political manoeuvre whose consequences would shape the course of the Second World War. Turning to the wife of the man who commanded Germany's submarine fleet and later served as Grand Admiral and briefly as the last Führer of what remained of the German state, we encounter Ingeborg Dönitz, the wife of Karl Dönitz. Ingeborg had married Dönitz in 1916 when he was a young naval officer with no particular prominence, and she had therefore accompanied the entire arc of his remarkable career from junior officer to supreme commander of the German Navy and ultimately to the head of the Nazi state for the 23 days between Hitler's death on April 30th and Germany's final unconditional surrender on May 8th, 1945. Dönitz was tried at Nuremberg and convicted of crimes against peace and war crimes, receiving a sentence of 10 years imprisonment. He served the full sentence at Spandau and was released in 1956. Ingeborg Dönitz did not live to see his release. She died in May 1962, having spent the decade of his imprisonment without him and having watched 2 of their 3 children die during the war, one a victim of a British destroyer attack on his submarine, the other killed in the fighting in Italy. The losses she suffered were real, as are the losses suffered by families on every side of every war, but they existed alongside and were in some ways a direct consequence of the war that her husband had served so faithfully. The story of Charlotte von Ribbentrop, the wife of Walter Funk, diverges slightly from the main thread of our story because Walter Funk was not a Ribbentrop at all, but rather the Reich's economics minister and the president of the Reichsbank. Louise Funk, born in 1901, married Walter Funk in 1932 when he was a prominent economic journalist and not yet among the senior Nazi leadership. Funk was a compliant and accommodating personality who did exactly what was required of him in the positions to which he was appointed, which in the case of the Reichsbank included accepting deposits of gold, jewellery, currency and other valuables that had been confiscated from murdered Jews in the extermination camps and processed through the SS before being deposited in the National Bank's vaults. This specific charge was among the most damning elements of the case against him at Nuremberg, where he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was released from Spandau in 1957 on grounds of ill health and died in 1960. Louise Funk survived him by several years, navigating the particularly uncomfortable position of the widow of a man whose crimes had been financial and administrative in nature and who had therefore attracted less public attention than the more dramatic figures, but whose actual guilt had been established with considerable precision. The position of Anni Brandt, the wife of Karl Brandt, who served as Hitler's personal physician and as the Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, brings us to one of the most disturbing chapters in the medical history of the Nazi regime. Karl Brandt was not simply a doctor who attended to the Führer's personal health, he was the senior official responsible for the systematic murder program known as Action T4, in which an estimated 200,000 Germans with physical and mental disabilities were killed by Nazi medical personnel in a program of involuntary euthanasia that began in 1939. He was additionally involved in the authorization and oversight of brutal medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners conducted without their consent. Anni Brandt, born Annie Reborn in 1906, was the niece of a prominent German swimmer and was herself an accomplished athlete before her marriage to Brandt in 1934. She occupied the position of senior medical official's wife in the Nazi hierarchy with apparent comfort and without recorded protest. Karl Brandt was tried before the American Military Tribunal in what became known as the Doctor's Trial, or the medical case, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials held under American jurisdiction. He was convicted and sentenced to death, being hanged on June 2, 1948, at Landsberg Prison. Annie survived him, living with the knowledge of what his medical career had actually entailed, and managing the post-war consequences of her association with a man convicted of crimes that struck at the very foundations of medical ethics. Let us turn now to one of the less frequently discussed but deeply significant figures in this collection, Erika von Neurath, the wife of Konstantin von Neurath, the former foreign minister of Germany who served as Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia before being replaced by Reinhard Heydrich. Neurath was one of the most senior members of the traditional German establishment to serve the Nazi regime in a major capacity, having been foreign minister from 1932 to 1938 before being eased out by Ribbentrop and having then taken the protectorate position in 1939. He was a conservative nationalist rather than an ideological Nazi, but his service to the regime was substantial and his responsibility for events in occupied Bohemia during his tenure was real, even if he was by the standards of that territory a relatively moderate administrator compared to the man who replaced him. At Nuremberg, he was convicted of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. He was released in 1954 on grounds of ill health, having served 8 of the 15 years. Erika von Neurath, who came from the German aristocratic and diplomatic establishment that her husband inhabited, managed the post-war circumstances of their family with the quiet dignity that her background had trained her to maintain in all conditions. Before we reach our final group of women, it is worth considering what the collective picture of all these lives tells us about something that Nazi Germany tried very deliberately to obscure: the role of women in enabling, sustaining, and in some cases actively participating in a criminal regime. The official ideology of National Socialism was deeply conservative about gender roles, assigning to women the primary sphere of home, church, and children, the famous Kinder, Kirche, Küche, and presenting the ideal German woman as a domestic figure whose contribution to the national community was biological and moral, rather than political or military. The women in this story, both embodied and dramatically, contradicted this ideology. They were supposed to be supportive wives in the background, and some of them genuinely occupied that position, but others wielded real power, sometimes through their husbands and sometimes in their own right. Lina Heydrich ran a forced labour operation. Magda Goebbels was an important public face of the regime in her own right. Margaret Himmler organised SS social networks and travelled through occupied territories, documenting what she saw with approving eyes. Emmy Goering cultivated a position of social influence that went beyond anything the official ideology assigned to women. And Hedwig Potthast sat at the very centre of the most powerful police apparatus in Europe, in a position of domestic authority over the man who ran it. The idea that these were passive bystanders without agency or responsibility does not survive contact with their actual lives. Now we come to Winifred Wagner, a woman who was not the wife of a Nazi official, but who was among the most significant female figures in the personal social world of Adolf Hitler, and whose post-war fate illustrates some of the extraordinary complexities of the denazification process when applied to cultural rather than directly political figures. Winifred Marjorie Williams was born in Hastings, England, on June 23, 1897, and was orphaned at a young age, eventually being adopted by a German family with deep connections to the world of German classical music. She married Siegfried Wagner, the son of the great composer Richard Wagner, in 1915, and became the director of the Bayreuth Festival, the annual celebration of Wagnerian opera that was one of the great cultural institutions of German musical life. After Siegfried's death in 1930, she ran the festival herself. What made Winifred Wagner's story so remarkable was the nature of her relationship with Adolf Hitler, whom she had known since 1923 and with whom she maintained a close personal friendship of such warmth and intimacy that contemporary observers speculated about a romantic dimension that was never formally acknowledged. Hitler regularly attended the Bayreuth Festival as her personal guest, and the relationship between Wahnfried, the Wagner family home at Bayreuth, and the Nazi leadership was one of the closest between the regime and the cultural establishment. After the war, Winifred Wagner was subjected to a denazification tribunal in 1947, which classified her as a major offender, the highest category of Nazi involvement, and sentenced her to 10 years of labour and a fine, as well as the forfeiture of her control over the Bayreuth Festival. In practice, the sentence was reduced on appeal, and she eventually served a shorter period before the festival was handed over to her sons, Wieland and Wolfgang Wagner, who set about reinventing Bayreuth as a modernist cultural institution, deliberately distancing itself from its Nazi past. Winifred never renounced her personal regard for Hitler. In 1975, she gave a lengthy interview to the filmmaker Hans-Jürgen Sieberberg, in which she maintained, with a directness that shocked much of the German public, that if Hitler walked through the door, she would still be glad to see him, that the Hitler she had known personally was a kind and considerate man, and that she refused to condemn him in the terms that post-war Germany required. The interview, which was incorporated into Sieberberg's epic film Hitler, a Film from Germany, became one of the most discussed and disturbing pieces of evidence about the psychology of those who had known Hitler personally and retained their affection for him despite everything. Winifred Wagner died on March 5, 1980, at the age of 82, having lived long enough to see Bayreuth become internationally celebrated again and to watch the world draw its clear and permanent verdict on the man she still called Wolf. The life of Paula Hitler, Adolf Hitler's younger and only surviving full sibling, does not fit neatly into the category of Nazi wife or mistress, since she was neither, but her post-war experience illuminates something important about what it meant to carry the most notorious surname in human history into the post-war world. Paula was born on January 21, 1896, in Hafeld, Austria, the sixth of Alois Hitler's children, though only the second of the two children by his third wife, Clara, to survive into adulthood. Adolf and Paula were therefore the only surviving children of their parents' marriage. Paula spent most of her adult life in Vienna and later Berchtesgaden, working as a secretary and an arts and crafts worker, deliberately maintaining a low profile and using the alias Paula Wolf during the Nazi years specifically to avoid the attention that her surname would have brought. Her relationship with her famous brother was cordial but distant. He provided her with financial support while apparently preferring that she remain entirely out of the public eye, a preference Paula seems to have shared. The two met only occasionally during the years of his power, and Paula's access to the inner circles of the Nazi state was essentially non-existent. She attended her brother's last birthday celebration on April 20th, 1945, at the Führerbunker in Berlin, 10 days before his death, in what proved to be their final meeting. After Germany's defeat, Paula Hitler was subjected to interrogation by American intelligence officers, who naturally had considerable interest in what she could tell them about her brother. The interrogation reports paint a picture of a quiet, rather ordinary woman who genuinely had limited insight into her brother's psychology or decision-making, and who had been as peripheral to the reality of the regime as her circumstances suggested. She was detained briefly and then released. She lived in Berchtesgaden under her alias, eventually acknowledging her real identity and spending her final years in modest circumstances. She died on June 1, 1960, at the age of 64 in a nursing home in Berchtesgaden, the last surviving member of Adolf Hitler's immediate family, having outlived every member of a generation that had reshaped and destroyed the world in ways that she had neither participated in, nor benefited from, nor, apparently, truly understood. Among the women we have not yet fully explored is Gerda Daranowski, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, who in 1943 married General Eckhard Christian of the Luftwaffe and thereby became Gerda Christian. The personal secretaries of Adolf Hitler occupied a unique position in the Nazi world, perhaps more intimate in their daily access to the Führer than almost anyone else in his circle, but with no political power of any kind. Traudl Junge, another of these secretaries who famously took dictation of Hitler's final testament in the bunker, later wrote one of the most important personal accounts of life in the Führer bunker until the final hour, which was turned into a documentary film and later inspired the fictional film Downfall. Gerda Christian remained in the bunker until the very end, escaping after Germany's surrender and spending the post-war years in relative obscurity in Düsseldorf, where she worked in the fashion industry. She lived until 1997, giving very few interviews about her experiences. Traudl Junge, whose experience of Hitler's final days was perhaps the most personally significant of any surviving witness, spent decades wrestling with the question of her own moral responsibility, her failure to see or to act on what she was seeing. Her late-life reckonings with that question, undertaken with a painful honesty that set her apart from most of the other survivors of the inner circle, made her one of the more morally serious figures in the entire story of what happened to those who had served the regime and lived. The story of Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler and Margarete, belongs to the next generation rather than the principal subjects of our story, but it is too remarkable to leave untouched because it illustrates the way that ideological devotion could persist and even intensify across generations in the absence of genuine reckoning. Gudrun was born on August 8, 1929, and grew up as the beloved and pampered daughter of the Reichsführer SS, accompanying her father on official visits that sometimes included tours of concentration camps, a fact that has been documented and that places her proximity to the regime's crimes at a level that goes well beyond the merely circumstantial. After the war, Gudrun became one of the leading figures in Stille Hilfe, the secret organisation founded to support SS members who were imprisoned, condemned or in hiding, which her mother Margaret had also supported. This was not a passive association. Gudrun Himmler, who married a man named Wolf-Dieter Burwitz and became known as Gudrun Burwitz, served as a leading operative of Stille Hilfe for decades, providing practical assistance and moral support to convicted war criminals, maintaining contact with former SS members, and operating as a central node in the network of unrepentant former Nazis that persisted in Germany long after the official reconstruction of the country had taken place. She died in May 2018 at the age of 88, having spent her entire adult life in service to the ideology her father had built into a machinery of mass murder, never publicly acknowledging the nature of what that ideology had meant in practice. As we move into the final portion of our examination of these remarkable and disturbing lives, it is worth dwelling for a moment on the extraordinary variety of ways that post-war Germany and the Allied powers approached the question of accountability for the women connected to the Nazi leadership. The inconsistency is striking. Some women faced prolonged detention and formal legal proceedings. Others passed through denazification tribunals that resulted in minor penalties almost, laughably disproportionate to their actual involvement. Still others were never formally charged with anything and simply reconstructed their lives behind the protective screen of post-war German society's widespread desire not to examine the recent past too closely. The contrast with the treatment of the senior male Nazi officials who faced either execution or lengthy prison sentences at Nuremberg was dramatic, and it reflected both genuine legal questions about the nature of individual culpability and some rather less principled assumptions about the limited agency of women within a patriarchal political system. The problem with those assumptions, as the actual record of these women's lives demonstrates, is that they were often simply wrong. The story of Manja Behrens, who was Martin Bormann's acknowledged mistress during the years of his greatest power, and who was invited by Bormann to share a domestic arrangement with his wife Gerda in one of the more bizarre episodes in the already bizarre personal lives of the Nazi leadership, deserves its own brief moment of attention. Behrens was an actress, professionally accomplished and physically striking, who had attracted Bormann's attention in the early 1940s. The extraordinary thing about her role in the Bormann household was not the affair itself, which was hardly unusual among senior Nazi men who treated the regime's public morality as an obligation that applied to others, but rather the degree to which Bormann attempted to formalize and rationalize the arrangement. His letters to Gerda about Manja are remarkable documents of self-delusion and entitlement, presenting the situation as something that a properly ideologically committed German woman should accept and even welcome as evidence of her husband's vitality and the superiority of the Germanic over the bourgeois approach to personal relationships. Goethe's apparent compliance with this arrangement tells us something disturbing about the psychological environment that sustained the Nazi inner circle. After the war, Behrens returned to acting and rebuilt a career in the German theatrical and film world that eventually achieved considerable distinction, a return to professional normality that she accomplished without any formal penalty or any requirement that she account for the years she had spent in intimate association with one of the most powerful and most criminal figures in the Nazi hierarchy. Another figure worth examining is Luise Solmitz, who represents not the inner circle of Nazi wives, but rather the broader phenomenon of middle-class German women who embraced National Socialism with enthusiasm and who then had to confront the consequences of that embrace. Solmitz kept an extraordinarily detailed diary across 4 decades, from the Weimar years through the Nazi period and into the post-war reconstruction of Germany. Her diary, which was discovered by historians after her death, provides one of the most detailed, personal records available of how an educated, conservative German woman perceived and responded to the events of the Nazi era. Her initial enthusiasm for Hitler's movement, her gradual awareness of the regime's darker dimensions, and her post-war attempts to understand and contextualize what she had supported make her diary one of the essential primary sources for understanding the psychology of ordinary middle-class German women under National Socialism. She was not a prominent figure, not a wife of anyone important, but her documented inner life is more revealing than the carefully managed memoirs of many of the women who inhabited higher positions in the regime's social world. The question of Eva Braun's awareness, which we touched upon at the opening of our story, is worth revisiting as we near its conclusion, because it connects to the broader question of what these women knew, what they chose not to know, and what the difference between those two categories actually means in any serious moral accounting. Eva Braun did not attend policy meetings or read Himmler's reports on the progress of the final solution, but she lived at the Berghof for years. She socialized with the women whose husbands were running the extermination program. She was photographed at parties with people whose conversations, had she been paying attention, could not have entirely concealed the nature of what was happening to European Jews. She went to the cinema. She read magazines. She was not intellectually deficient or socially isolated. The argument that she was entirely ignorant requires us to believe in a form of determined not knowing that is, in moral terms, not entirely different from knowing. This applies in different degrees and different specific contexts to virtually every woman in this story. There is one woman whose post-war story stands as something of a counterpoint to the majority of those we have examined, and that is Henriette von Schirach, whose moment of confrontation with Hitler over the treatment of Dutch Jews we described earlier, whether her protest constituted genuine moral courage or merely a delayed and limited reaction to crimes that had been visible for years, is a question that reasonable historians have answered differently. But what is significant about her post-war life is that she was, among the women of the Nazi inner circle, one of the more willing to engage with the actual historical record of what the regime had done, and to acknowledge, however incompletely, the weight of that record. Her memoir, Price of Glory, published in 1956, described her experiences with a frankness that was unusual among women of her background and circle, acknowledging the crimes of the regime while also attempting to explain from the inside the social and psychological mechanisms that made opposition so difficult and so rare. The book was criticized for its self-serving elements, which were real, but it was also recognized as one of the more honest attempts by an insider to engage with the moral questions that the Nazi era demanded. We should also spend a moment with the remarkable and deeply troubling case of Karin Goering, Hermann Goering's first wife, who died in 1931 before the Nazi seizure of power and therefore never had to confront the world that her husband and his associates subsequently built. Karin von Kanzow, née Fock, was a Swedish baroness who had abandoned her first husband and her young son to marry Goering in 1923, following him through the chaos of the beer hall putsch, through his morphine addiction, through his years of exile in Sweden and Austria. When he was a fugitive from German justice, she was a woman of genuine romantic passion and almost mystical nationalist conviction who had embraced the early Nazi movement with a fervour that some contemporaries described as almost religious. She died of tuberculosis on October 17, 1931, in Stockholm, leaving Goering devastated. He named the great estate he built north of Berlin carried all in her honour and kept her memory central to his personal mythology throughout the years of his power, even after his marriage to Emmy. The question of what Karin would have made of the world her husband built is an impossible counterfactual, but the intensity of her documented commitment to the early movement suggests she would not have been among those who drew back in horror. The story of the women connected to the lesser-known Nazi leaders, the Gauleiters and regional commanders and second-tier ministers whose names are less familiar to the general public but whose responsibilities were often enormous, follows similar patterns to those we have been tracing throughout this video. The wife of Arthur Greiser, the Gauleiter of the Reichsgau Vortherland in occupied Poland, lived in a territory where her husband presided over some of the earliest and most systematic mass killings of Jews outside of the Soviet Union, including the operation of the Chelmno extermination camp. The wife of Erich Koch, the brutal Gauleiter of Ukraine, inhabited a world where her husband's regime of terror against the civilian population was so extreme that it helped drive millions of Ukrainians who had initially welcomed the Germans as liberators into the arms of the Soviet partisan movement. These women were not sentenced to death. They were not, in most cases, formally tried at all. They lived with the knowledge of what their proximity to power had meant in the quiet of post-war German private life, in the middle-class suburbs and alpine villages where the survivors of the regime rebuilt their existences and where the larger German society was simultaneously attempting the impossible task of moving forward while not looking too directly back. One of the more poignant aspects of the collective story of these women is the variety of their deaths. Eva Braun died at 33 with her husband in the bunker, choosing a very particular form of loyalty and oblivion. Magda Goebbels died at 43, having first killed her 6 children in an act that defies adequate moral description. Geli Raubal died at 23 in circumstances that remain somewhat ambiguous, though the probability is suicide. Unity. Mitford lingered for years with a bullet in her brain before dying at 33 of its delayed effects. Margaret Himmler lived until 1967 under a false name, stripped of her status and her pension, dying at 74. Lina Heydrich reached 74, unrepentant to the last. Ilse Hess achieved the remarkable age of 95, having never in all those decades expressed the slightest regret. Emmy Goering died at 80, her 1 year in prison essentially the only formal consequence she faced. Annelies von Ribbentrop died in 1973, having devoted 30 years to vindicating a man who had been hanged for crimes against humanity. And Gerda Bormann died of tuberculosis in 1946, never knowing that the husband she mourned had been dead since May 1945. The variety of these fates tells us something important about the randomness of historical accountability and about the way that the particular political and legal circumstances of the post-war period shaped what consequences people faced. It is also worth examining what became of the children of these women, the next generation born into the inner circles of the Nazi state, because their stories add another layer of complexity to the already deeply complicated moral landscape we have been mapping. We have already mentioned Niklas Frank, the son of Hans Frank and Brigitte, who became one of the most publicly engaged of all the children of the Nazi elite in confronting and condemning his parents. His determination to engage honestly with his father's crimes and to reject entirely the self-exculpatory narratives that his mother and others like her constructed made him a deeply controversial but also deeply respected figure in post-war German public life. His approach was the exception rather than the rule. Far more typical was the response of Wolf Rüdiger Hess, the son of Rudolf and Ilse, who shared his mother's conviction that his father had been unjustly imprisoned, and who devoted enormous energy to campaigning for his release. Even after Rudolf Hess's death in 1987 and the confirmation of his suicide, Wolf Rüdiger continued to maintain that his father had been murdered, a theory that attracted considerable attention in certain circles but that the available evidence does not support. He died in 2001, still committed to the revisionist interpretation of his father's fate and his father's record. The Goering daughter, Edda, whose birth in 1938 had been celebrated by her father with a flyover of 500 aircraft above Berlin, grew up to be a devoted defender of her father's reputation, insisting in interviews throughout her adult life that the Goering she had known was a loving and generous man, and that the crimes attributed to him had been exaggerated or distorted by Allied propaganda. Her persistence in this view, maintained over decades against the weight of historical evidence that had only grown more detailed and more damning with each passing year of scholarship, made her one of the more visible examples of the psychological mechanism by which the children of prominent Nazis maintained their family loyalties in the face of an overwhelming historical record. Eva Goering died in December 2018 at the age of 80, having lived longer than almost all of the other children of senior Nazi officials of her generation, and having never publicly accepted the judgment that history had reached about her father. The case of Rolf Mengele, the son of Josef Mengele, the SS physician who conducted murderous experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, provides yet another variation on the theme of how the children of perpetrators have navigated their impossible inheritance. Rolf was raised in Germany without knowledge of his father's true identity, his father having escaped Germany after the war's end and lived in Argentina and later Paraguay under various false identities for decades. When Rolf eventually made contact with his father and learned the truth of what Josef Mengele had done at Auschwitz, he struggled visibly and publicly with the implications of that knowledge. His mother Irene, from whom Josef had been separated, was one of the many wives of prominent Nazi perpetrators who lived in post-war Germany under the complicated circumstances of a missing husband whose crimes were known to everyone except officially to them. Josef Mengele died by drowning in Brazil in 1979, his body not definitively identified until DNA testing in 1992. Let us also spend a final moment with the remarkable Traudl Junge, whom we mentioned earlier, because her post-war life represents one of the more interesting examples of genuine moral self-examination among those who served in Hitler's immediate circle, Gertrud. Humps was born in 1920 in Munich and was hired as one of Hitler's personal secretaries in 1942. She was 22 years old when she began the job that would define her place in history. She was present in the Führer bunker throughout the final weeks of the war and took down Hitler's dictation of his personal and political testaments on the night of April 28 to 29, 1945. She escaped Berlin in the chaos of the final days and was captured, interrogated, and eventually released. For decades afterwards, she gave few public interviews and appeared to process her experiences privately. But in 1947, she wrote a memoir of her time in the bunker that she kept in a drawer, unpublished for decades, revising and expanding it across the years as her understanding deepened. It was finally published in 2002 as Until the Final Hour, and immediately recognized as one of the essential first-hand accounts of life inside the Nazi leadership. In the memoir and in later interviews, Junge expressed her regret and her inability to forgive herself for the years she had spent serving a man whose crimes she had chosen not to investigate and not to see, even when the evidence was available to her. Her honesty about this failure of moral vision, her refusal to claim the excuse of ignorance that so many others deployed, made her account distinctively valuable and her reflection distinctively moral. She died on February 10, 2002, the year her memoir was finally published, at the age of 81, having lived long enough to bring her testimony fully into the public record. The broader question of how post-war Germany processed the specific history of women's involvement in and complicity with the Nazi regime has itself been a subject of significant scholarly attention in the past 3 decades. For many years, the dominant narrative in West Germany focused on the crimes of men, the Nuremberg defendants, the SS perpetrators, the military commanders. Women were largely invisible in this accounting, categorized as passive victims of male domination or as figures whose domestic subordination rendered them effectively irrelevant to the real moral drama of perpetration and resistance. It was not until the 1990s, and particularly after German reunification and the opening of East German and Soviet archives, that historians began to examine women's roles with the same rigor they had applied to men, and the results were disturbing. Hundreds of thousands of German women had served in the occupied territories as administrators, guards, nurses, and workers in the machinery of occupation and genocide. Tens of thousands had served as guards at women's concentration camps, some of them achieving a notoriety for cruelty that was exceptional even in those environments. The wives and companions of the senior Nazi leadership were among the most visible of these women, but they were not exceptional in their complicity. They were among the most privileged representatives of a much broader female participation in the Nazi project that post-war society had collectively agreed not to examine too carefully. What would any of these women say today if they could speak to us from across the decades? The honest answer for most of them is that they would say exactly what they said when they were alive, that they did what they thought was right, that they did not know what they could not have been expected to know, that they served their country and their husbands and their children, that history had judged them unfairly, that the world that followed the war was built on the lies of the victors about the innocence of the vanquished. Most of them never broke. Most of them never really looked. The willingness to look honestly at what one has been part of, the willingness to follow the evidence of one's own complicity into the darkest places that evidence leads, was the rarest quality in the entire population of Nazi women that we have examined today, and its rarity is part of what makes the story of these women so enduringly significant and so troubling. The ability to participate in and benefit from a criminal system while maintaining an internal narrative of innocence is not a capacity unique to the women of the Third Reich. It is a distinctly human one, and understanding how it works in its most extreme historical manifestation is one of the reasons why this history continues to demand our attention. The palaces and estates that many of these women inhabited, the art collections assembled from the property of murdered Jews, the formal gowns worn to state banquets while the genocide was proceeding in the East, the furs and the jewellery and the champagne and the opera boxes, all of it rested on an infrastructure of mass murder. Some of these women understood this clearly and embraced it anyway. Others understood it dimly and chose the dimness. And a very few, perhaps, genuinely did not understand it, though the historical evidence for this category is thinner than the memoirs of its claimed members would suggest. What they all shared was the experience of elevation, the sense of being at the centre of the most powerful state in Europe, at the apex of a hierarchy that was remaking the world, surrounded by men who had the power of life and death over populations that stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga. That elevation is gone. The Third Reich lasted 12 years and destroyed more of the world than any human enterprise in history. When it fell, it took with it not only the men who built it, but the world that their wives and mistresses had inhabited, a world of lethal glamour that left behind it only rubble, grief, and a moral debt that no accounting has fully settled. Some of the women in this story lived for decades after Germany's defeat. Ilse Hess reached 95, Lina Heydrich died at 74, Emmy Goering lived to 80, Annelies von Ribbentrop made it to 77. They lived long enough to see Germany rebuilt from the ruins their husbands had created, long enough to watch their country join a European community built on the explicit repudiation of everything they had believed in, long enough to see their children and grandchildren grow up in a world that treated the ideology they had served as the definition of historical evil. How they carried that within themselves in the private hours of their long post-war lives is something we can only speculate about. The ones who wrote self-justification. The ones who spoke defense. The silence at the center of these lives, the silence where genuine reckoning should have been, is perhaps the most significant thing about them. It is the silence of people who had made their choices and couldn't afford, emotionally or psychologically, to truly look at what those choices had meant. Well, that is our story of the Nazi princesses, the women who shared the lives and the world of Hitler's closest collaborators, and who then had to navigate the wreckage that those collaborators left behind. Their fates were as varied as their personalities and their levels of involvement. Execution alongside husbands and children, decades in prison, brief detention followed by quiet post-war lives, long campaigns of historical revisionism, or simply the slow reconstruction of ordinary existences from the ruins of extraordinary ones. What unites all of them is the central question that their lives pose, and that history has not yet finished answering. How do we account, morally and legally, for the women who did not pull the triggers but who kept the world in which the triggers were pulled, not only functioning, but comfortable, glamorous, and even joyful? It is a question that matters not just for its historical interest, but for what it tells us about the nature of complicity in our own time, about the human capacity to inhabit systems of terrible injustice without allowing the knowledge of that injustice to disturb the surface of a privileged life. The women of the Nazi inner circle live that capacity to its most extreme possible limit, and their stories are our warning and our mirror. Thanks for watching. If you found this video valuable, make sure to check out our related content on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders and the fates of the senior Wehrmacht commanders after the war. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another piece of fascinating and essential World War II history. See you in the next one. But before we close, there are several more remarkable women in this story whose fates deserve their full accounting, and we owe it to the historical record to give them that attention. Let us turn to a figure who in many ways represents the full arc of the Nazi wife's experience in its most complete and tragic form. Margaret Speer, born Margaret Weber in 1905, who became the wife of Albert Speer in 1928, and who therefore accompanied the most complex and most publicly discussed of all the Nuremberg defendants through the entire trajectory of his rise, his crimes, his conviction, his imprisonment, and his post-war celebrity. We touched on her story earlier, but the full dimensions of it require more careful examination. Margaret, known to her family and friends as Annie, grew up in Heidelberg and met Speer when both were students there. They married when he was 23 and she was 22, and the early years of their union were the years of the Weimar Republic's collapse and the Nazi seizure of power, during which Speer's career transformed from that of a struggling young architect with a family to support into one of the most powerful and sought-after figures in the Third Reich. The transformation of the Speers' circumstances was breathtaking in its speed and its scale. Within a few years of the Nazi seizure of power, Albert Speer was Hitler's personal architect, overseeing the design of the great buildings and spaces that were supposed to represent the physical fabric of the Thousand-Year Reich, and he and Annie were living a life of extraordinary privilege and social eminence. They had 6 children who were raised in the grand residences that Speer's position made available. Annie moved in the highest circles of Nazi society, attending events at which the murderers of Europe were the guests of honor and the hosts. She was an intelligent and perceptive woman by all accounts, and the question of what she perceived and what she chose not to perceive during the years when her husband was operating at the center of the most criminal regime in modern history has never been satisfactorily answered in the historical literature. Speer himself, who spent 20 years in Spandau prison constructing an elaborate intellectual argument for his own innocence, appears to have maintained to Annie, at least in the early post-war years, something like the same argument he maintained to the Nuremberg tribunal. Whether she believed it, whether she wanted to believe it, or whether she understood perfectly well that it was a constructed position and simply accepted it because the alternative was unlivable, is something only she knew. When Speer was released from Spandau on September 30th, 1966, his emergence into the post-war world was managed with extraordinary care. His memoir, Inside the Third Reich, which he had partly written in Spandau by smuggling pages out of the prison, became one of the most successful works of historical autobiography of the 20th century. It presented the world with exactly the image Speer had been cultivating since his Nuremberg performance. The cultivated, intelligent, essentially decent man who had been corrupted by proximity to genius, who had served a criminal system without being a criminal, who had known less than he might have and regretted everything. The book was a literary achievement of considerable skill and a moral deception of comparable proportion. Historian Gitta Sereni, who spent years researching Speer's life in meticulous detail, reached the conclusion in her landmark work, Albert Speer, his battle with truth that Speer had known far more about the Holocaust than he admitted, had been present at Himmler's Posen speech in October 1943, in which the mass murder of the Jews was explicitly described to senior Nazi officials, and had maintained his false position across decades with a discipline that amounted to a sustained lie. The title of Sereni's book is a rueful acknowledgement that Speer's battle with the truth was one he chose, ultimately, to lose. For Annie Speer, who had lived through the imprisonment and the reunion and the celebrity and the gradual erosion of the carefully constructed story, the accumulated weight of this history was something she carried through the remainder of her long life. She died in 1987, the same year as Rudolf Hess's death in Spandau, having outlived most of the remarkable and terrible company she had once been part of, and having watched her husband's reputation begin its slow but inexorable collapse under the pressure of more rigorous historical examination. The story of Dorothee Binz, while not that of a Nazi wife in the conventional sense, belongs in any comprehensive account of women's roles in the Nazi system, because she represents one of the categories of female participation that post-war historiography spent decades obscuring. Binz was born in 1920 and joined the SS Female Auxiliary in the late 1930s, eventually becoming one of the most senior and most notorious of the female guards at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was the principal camp for women in the Nazi system. She rose to the position of deputy supervisor, overseeing the treatment of prisoners that by any measure constituted crimes against humanity: beatings, torture, the supervision of executions, the selection of prisoners for murder. She was not the wife of a prominent Nazi. She was a perpetrator in her own right, and her case illustrates the important point that women's involvement in the Nazi system of terror was not limited to the domestic and social sphere of the leadership's wives and mistresses. Thousands of women served in the concentration camp system, and many of them participated actively in the persecution and murder of prisoners. Binns was tried by a British military tribunal in the Ravensbrück trial of 1947, convicted of war crimes, and hanged on May 2, 1947, at the age of 26. Her case, and those of the other female guards tried alongside her, were among the first instances in which the courts formally recognised that women could be perpetrators of crimes against humanity rather than merely witnesses or accessories to them. The figure of Maria Mandl, who served as the chief female warden at the Auschwitz-Birkenau women's camp from 1942 to 1944, similarly demonstrates the full extent of female participation in the machinery of the Holocaust. Mandl, known to prisoners as the Beast, had personal authority over the lives of hundreds of thousands of women prisoners during her tenure, and she exercised that authority with a combination of organizational efficiency and gratuitous cruelty that made her one of the most feared figures in the entire Auschwitz complex. She selected prisoners for the gas chambers, participated in beatings and punishment drills, and was personally responsible, by the testimony of survivors, for actions that resulted in numerous deaths. She was captured by American forces after the war's end, extradited to Poland, tried before a Polish court in Krakow in the Auschwitz trial of 1947, convicted of crimes against humanity, and executed by hanging on January 24, 1948. Her case, and those of the other female perpetrators brought to trial in the post-war period, represent an important corrective to the narrative that located all the primary perpetrators of Nazi violence among the male leadership. The women, who served in the camps, were not on the same scale of historical visibility as the men who designed and administered the system at the highest levels, but they were perpetrators nonetheless, and the justice applied to them, where it was applied at all, was in many cases the harshest that any of the women in this story faced. How did the women who had inhabited the glittering social world of the Nazi leadership feel about the women who had served in the camps when they thought about them at all? The answer, in most cases, is that they did not. The distance between the dinner parties at the Berghof and the selections on the Birkenau platform was a distance that the wives and mistresses of the senior leadership maintained as carefully after the war as they had maintained it during the war itself. The shared category of women who had served the Nazi state was too uncomfortable for them to acknowledge, because to acknowledge it would have required them to place themselves on a moral continuum that they preferred not to recognize. Better to insist on the irreducible difference between themselves, who had merely been loyal wives in an extraordinary historical moment, and the women who had committed acts that everyone agreed were crimes. The distinction they drew was real in legal terms, but much less clear in moral ones. The loyalty that sustained the social world of the Nazi leadership was the same loyalty, at a different level of proximity and a different degree of knowledge, that sustained the operations of the camps. Both depended on people choosing not to see what was in front of them, choosing not to ask the questions that would have produced unbearable answers, choosing the comfort of their particular position over the responsibility that genuine moral awareness would have imposed. We should close our examination with one final figure who has not yet received her full due in this account: Gertrud Scholtz-Klink, who held the extraordinary position of Reichsfrauenführerin, the leader of German women, from 1934 until the war's end. Scholtz-Klink was perhaps the most powerful woman in the official Nazi hierarchy, presiding over the Reich Women's Service and the NS Frauenschaft, the women's organization of the Nazi Party, and overseeing the mobilization of millions of German women in service to the regime's social and ideological programs. She was born in 1902 in Adelsheim and had been a Nazi activist since the earliest days of the movement. She was not the wife of a prominent Nazi, but a senior official in her own right, holding a position that gave her authority over a vast organizational apparatus and making her a significant figure in the implementation of the regime's social policies. Her ideology was entirely aligned with the regime's. She articulated the role of German women as fundamentally domestic and biological, celebrated motherhood as women's highest patriotic duty, and presided over programs designed to increase the birth rate of racially acceptable Germans while simultaneously supporting the measures that excluded and persecuted those the regime classified as racially undesirable. After Germany's defeat, Scholtz-Klink managed to conceal her identity for several years, living under a false name until she was discovered by French occupation authorities in 1948. She was tried and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment and subsequently faced denazification proceedings that resulted in a further period of confinement. She then lived quietly in West Germany for decades, occasionally giving interviews in which she maintained that her work had been genuinely aimed at improving the lives of German women, and that the broader context of the regime's crimes had not been her responsibility. She died in 1999 at the age of 97, one of the longest-lived of all the figures associated with the Nazi leadership, and one of the least repentant. The 1700 days of the Third Reich, the 12 years between January 1933 and May 1945, compressed into that relatively brief span, a transformation of European civilization so catastrophic and so complete that its full dimensions are still being mapped by historians nearly 80 years later. The women we have examined in this video were not the primary architects of that catastrophe. That credit belongs to the men whose names are more familiar: Hitler, Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, Heydrich, Ribbentrop. But the women who shared their lives shared something of their world, and therefore something of their responsibility, in varying degrees and by varying measures of moral calculation. They were not passive. They were not entirely ignorant. They were not simply swept along by forces too powerful to resist. They were human beings who made choices in specific circumstances with specific consequences, and the fact that those choices were made by women rather than men doesn't exempt them from the accounting that history requires of all, of us who have the opportunity to choose between complicity and conscience. What they chose, most of them, most of the time, was to hold what they had and look away. And the world they were looking away from was burning. Among the women we have not yet given their full due in this survey are the wives of several other significant Nazi figures whose stories round out the picture with important details. The case of Erna Petry is one of the most extreme in the historical record of female perpetration during the Nazi years, a case that fundamentally challenges any comfortable narrative about women's peripheral relationship to the violence of the regime. Erna was the wife of an SS officer and plantation manager in occupied Ukraine, and in 1943 she personally shot dead 6 Jewish children who had escaped from a transport and were sheltering near her estate. The case was uncovered in East German criminal investigations in the 1960s, and Erna Petry was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The case shocked the German public precisely because it demonstrated that the capacity for direct physical violence against the victims of the Holocaust was not limited to male perpetrators in uniform. The children she murdered ranged in age from 3 to 8 years old. She was released from prison in 1992. Her case is among the most extreme documented examples of female perpetration of genocidal violence during the Nazi era, but it is not unique. Dozens of similar cases were identified in the post-war decades, and historians believe that many more went unprosecuted or even uninvestigated because of the assumption that women could not have been primary perpetrators of this kind of violence. The broader post-war legal landscape for women associated with the Nazi regime was characterized by a systematic undervaluation of female culpability that had real consequences for the amount of justice that was ultimately served. At the major international trials at Nuremberg, no women were among the defendants. At the subsequent American military tribunal trials, only one woman was tried among the 23 defendants in the medical case, the nurse Elizabeth Marshall, who received a relatively light sentence. At the British Ravensbrück trials, women were tried in greater numbers, but the overall pattern across the denazification process and the subsequent German domestic prosecutions was one in which women received significantly lighter treatment than men with comparable records. This disparity reflected partly the genuine legal difficulty of establishing individual culpability in complex organizational hierarchies, partly the practical limitations of the post-war legal apparatus, and partly a set of assumptions about gender and agency that allowed women to benefit from a presumption of passivity that the historical record did not support. For the wives and companions of the very highest Nazi officials, the legal consequences were, with some exceptions, genuinely light. The women who were tried at all faced denazification proceedings rather than criminal courts. The denazification tribunals operated on a 5-category system, ranging from major offenders to exonerated, and while several of the women in our story received classifications in the higher categories, the actual consequences, in terms of material penalty and loss of freedom, were modest compared to what the criminal law might have imposed. Several of the most deeply implicated women, including Lina Heydrich and Ilse Hess, emerged from the process with their basic freedoms and a significant portion of their material circumstances intact. The sense that justice had been only incompletely served in the cases of these women was noted at the time, and has been noted repeatedly by historians in the decades since. And yet, the full reckoning has come in a different form and over a much longer timeline than the immediate post-war justice systems could have managed. The work of historians across the past 8 decades has progressively exposed the truth about what these women knew, what they chose, and what they benefited from. The scholarly literature on women in the Third Reich has grown from near silence in the immediate post-war decades to a substantial and rigorous body of work that has fundamentally altered our understanding of the Nazi regime and of the specific mechanisms by which ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil. The names of the women in this video are now part of that historical record in a way they would not have been if the history had been written only by the survivors of their husbands' crimes. The full truth about the Nazi princesses and their fates is now known, or at least knowable, and that knowability is itself a form of accountability that outlasts the immediate judgments of the courts. There is a final thought worth offering as we conclude this examination of some of history's most compelling and most troubling women. The title we have given this video, Nazi Princesses, is deliberately provocative because it captures something real about the combination of privilege and complicity that defined these lives. They were not queens in any legitimate sense. They were not the wives of rulers whose authority derived from law or consent or tradition. They were the companions of men who had seized power through violence and maintained it through terror. And the glittering world they inhabited was built on a foundation of atrocity. The jewels were stolen. The palaces were looted. The labour that maintained the estates was forced from human beings who had been stripped of their freedom and frequently of their lives. And the women who wore those jewels and lived in those palaces and accepted that labour knew enough, most of them, to know that the cost was too high if they had allowed themselves to count it. The fact that most of them did not allow themselves to count it, that most of them chose instead. The pleasures and privileges of the moment over the moral clarity that would have required them to reject everything they had is the central and disturbing fact about all of them. They were not monsters in the sense that their husbands were, but they were not innocent either. They were something more interesting and more human than either of those categories. They were people who chose, repeatedly and in full knowledge of the consequences for others, to be comfortable rather than good. And that choice, made at scale across an entire society and an entire social class, is part of what made the Third Reich possible. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into some of history's most haunting stories, both informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to the children of Nazi leaders and how the next generation grappled with the impossible legacy of their parents. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content that goes beyond the familiar headlines into the human stories at the heart of history's darkest chapter. See you in the next one.